two. This is my great pleasure to welcome Gabriela Minden, she says she's completing her doctorate in English literature at the University of Oxford. Well, actually, she's completed it, and she is going to have her viva on Thursday, so we'll wish her all the very best for that. I've spent a couple of years, many years, fondly working with Gabriela on her thesis. Her research focuses on recovering the complex ways in which developments in dance came to bear on dramatic texts, theatre theories, and dramaturgical practices in early 20th century Britain. And there's a focus on the ballet russe in her thesis, which is really fascinating to see the way in which the ballet russe gets into the interstices of dramaturgical innovation in the 20th century. So today, Gabriela is talking about, hang on, I'm not sure I can say this, Gabriela. Why don't you introduce yourself? Okay, Gabriela, come on. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you, Steve, for that wonderful introduction, and Alistair as well for opening the summer school with a sort of introduction into all of these codified systems of notation. And I want to take a slightly different look at what are sort of not even a system of notation, but certainly uncodified, and notations that are not necessarily understood by anyone else. And so anyone who was at the summer school last year, the production I'm going to talk about might be familiar. And this extension should stand on its own, but if you're interested in learning more about this production, W.H. Auden and Rupert Doone's The Dance of Death, please do feel free to look at the video from last year. So, 1737 was a pivotal year in British theatre history. It was then that Parliament passed an act giving the Lord Chamberlain the power to license plays, introducing government control over what was allowed on the British stage. In 1843, a new provision came into force that required government approval before any new play could be performed. From then until 1968, when theatre censorship was abolished in the UK, scripts of new plays had to be submitted to the Lord Chamberlain's office for licensing. This would involve a reader examining the script and writing a report that described the play and detailed any sort of suspect content. Informed by this report, the Lord Chamberlain would then either grant or deny a performance license, sometimes requiring the excision or emendation of certain passages before a license could be granted. So, what type of content was the Lord Chamberlain seeking to sort of purge from the British stage? This depended on the historical context, of course, but censorship often targeted things like immoral content or political messages that might incite anti-government feeling. In the 1930s, the period that I want to talk about today, there were two particularly pressing areas of concern. In line with the British government's attempts to avoid war with Nazi Germany, in the 1930s, the Lord Chamberlain was becoming increasingly intolerant of staged critiques of sort of Hitler-esque characters or Germanic fascist regimes. In a similar vein, the British government's anxiety about Stalin's Soviet Union meant that communist propaganda was equally unwelcome on the British stage. Steve Nicholson, who is the sort of foremost expert on 20th century theatre censorship in the UK, has argued that the Lord Chamberlain was so resolute on these matters that no appraisal of British theatre in the 1930s can fail to acknowledge the role of official censorship in determining what audiences could see or what playwrights could write. So in 1935, in the midst of this period of politically motivated theatre censorship, London's experimental group theatre opened its first public season with a production of W.H. Auden's The Dance of Death. This poetic dramatic satire addressed the political exigencies of pre-war Britain in a remarkably direct way, offering everything from a communal dance that spreads Germanic fascism in a sort of syphilitic manner and ends in a Nazi salute, to a scene representing Karl Marx and his comrades committing a mass murder of the nationalistic middle class. Despite the Dance of Death's presentation of this contagious mode of Germanic fascism that's ultimately stamped out by communism incarnate, when the script was submitted to the Lord Chamberlain for licensing, the reader, G.S. Street, had no objections to the Dance of Death. He deemed Auden's satiric extravaganza the most incomprehensible play I've had the misfortune to read, and lamented that no meaning emerges from the text, and so he granted the license without requiring the slightest emendation. Yes. So today I want to talk about how the Dance of Death's extraordinary evasion of theatre censorship was greatly indebted to a figure whom scholarship has tended to overlook, and that is Rupert Doone, founding director of the group theatre, erstwhile lover and collaborator of Jean Cocteau, friend and colleague of Lydia Lepokova, Nanette de Valois, and Leonid Massine, as I think this image sort of makes clear. And crucially, he was a former dancer with Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. Shaped by his experiences with Diaghilev, Doone believed that poetic drama should aspire to the same sort of marriage of the arts that had been developed by the Russian ballet. And at the group theatre, he endeavored to create the kind of Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk that arose from a confluence of disparate aesthetic elements but still privileged the art of dance. To that end, Doone collaborated closely with Auden on the Dance of Death, ensuring a production whose radical politics were created not by the text on its own, but rather by this complex combination of poetic dramatic text, visual metaphor, and corporeal rhetoric. Significantly, this meant that examining the production's choreographic Didascalia, that is, all the stage directions that indicated movement or choreographic expression, would have been crucial to understanding the politics of the group theatre's production of the Dance of Death. However, as we shall see, these stage directions existed largely as sort of handwritten insertions into the group theatre's prompt book, and they did not have to be submitted to the Lord Chamberlain's office for licensing. So, taking the choreographic Didascalia of the Dance of Death as a point of departure, I want to look more closely at what proves to be a quite remarkable dance, if you will, between Doone and the group theatre attempting to stage these deeply political works and the Lord Chamberlain's office striving to sort of outmaneuver them. Before we delve into Doone's choreography for the Dance of Death, it might be helpful to have some idea of the plot. Interestingly, this is not as straightforward as it sounds, as the Lord Chamberlain's office was not alone in finding Auden's text rather difficult to understand. When the text was first published in this slim volume by Faber and Faber in 1933, which is before it was performed, critics found the text provocative doggerel that on reading was somewhat abstruse, and the political message, although left-leaning, was frustratingly imprecise. However, Auden would later provide a synopsis that both reveals much about how he conceived of this satire on modern life and provides a sort of helpful summary of the action. Auden writes that death appears as a dancer. The announcer is fate and also death's mouthpiece. Death symbolizes that decay which exists within a class of society. Always inspired and always betrayed by the death inside them, this class pursue at first one utopia and then another without really wanting new life because secretly they desire the old. Auden then outlines the three utopias that this class pursues. Death as the sun god, which focuses on the flashback to pre-war arrogance. Death as demagogue, which marks the turn to fascism. And death as pilot to the heart of reality. So once the dancer has led the middle class on a sort of Dantean journey through these three utopias, Karl Marx arrives, only to watch the dancer expire and to pronounce in what proved to be the closing lines of the play, the instruments of production have been too much for him. He is liquidated. So this ending made it difficult even for leftist critics to extract a sort of clear political message from the palpable Marxist inclination of the text. Yet, if we remember that Auden and Doone collaborated very closely throughout the composition process, the ambiguity of Auden's text, which is almost closer to a libretto, does not come as a surprise. As Auden himself would argue, the Dance of Death is meant for acting, not reading. It depends so much on the music and dancing to give it body. So the group theatre's prompt book, which, as you can see, is a heavily annotated copy of the Faber edition of The Dance of Death, bears witness to the extent to which Doone used corporeal rhetoric to reinforce, undermine, and augment textual meaning throughout the rehearsal and performance process. This prompt book offers elaboration on Doone's solo dances, and the movements of the chorus are carefully notated throughout. These notations reveal how Doone added a new political dimension to the Dance of Death, creating a political message that manifests itself not only in the text, but also in the dance. So as these images demonstrate, the choreography was inscribed both in the margins and in these sort of full-page inserts that provided space for greater detail. This scene, which is the point at which the chorus transitions from the first to the second utopia, which is from communism, and a photograph of this scene reveals the political sentiment of this movement is paralleled in the stage decorations themselves. As we can see, the chorus is grouped together and saluting Doone whilst waving these large flags bearing N's that suggest the word Nazi, along with a German military emblem, the Iron Cross. The chorus then assumes a second grouping and turns to beat up the stage manager, who has been identified as a, quote, dirty Jew. Their transition to fascism complete, the chorus form this corporeal ship of England to cross the ocean and save the Anglo-Saxon race, hoisting Doone, their gallant captain, up onto their shoulders to lead the way. In this ship, the chorus sings of racial purity, interestingly evoking the Nuremberg laws that had been enacted just weeks before the Dance of Death's 1935 public premiere. The ship then hits a storm, and Doone begins whirling around the stage before dissolving into an epileptic fit. On the right-hand side here, we can see that the chorus's formation breaks up, and they begin whispering SE diseases with concerned glances at dancer. So S here seems to code syphilis, particularly when combined with the sort of covert whispers of the chorus and the dancer's epileptic fit. Disease and fascist ideology prove to be of the same communicable nature, sort of spreading through the figure of the dancer. But it is not yet time for the dancer's death. After the dancer receives an injection and a warning to stay away from politics, the play moves on to a scene that sees the dancer become the pilot to the heart of reality that culminates in the dancer's paralysis. The scene then moves quickly to a nightclub that the German theater manager has opened. Members of the audience at this point climbed onto the stage to join the nightclub, and they begin to speak in an English approximation of the German language. The dancer is then wheeled in to complete his will, and he offers some sort of repentance, leaving all of his possessions to the working class. He then buys a round of drinks for a New Year's toast, and as the clock strikes 12, the chorus adopts this same Germanic manner of speaking. If we recall their earlier embrace of fascist ideology, this linguistic switch has a sort of sinister trace to it. However, the performance of the Dance of Death has a distinctly new solution for this. Whereas in Auden's text, Karl Marx enters after the dancer has passed away from sort of vigorous dancing, in performance, Marx enters after 2 gunshots are heard offstage and 3 more gunshots occur on stage. A review by Ivor Brown indicates that it was not only the dancer who dies in this scene. Brown writes that at the end of the group theater's production, the noble red shirts come along and liquidate the middle class. I gathered that a little mass murder was supposed to be a happy ending. So Marx eliminates the middle class, causing the final lines of the play, the instruments of production have been too much for him, he is liquidated, to become heavily ironic. But there's also a patriotism to this act. It's followed by the chorus wrapping the corpse of the dancer in the Union Jack and carrying him off stage. And as the play closes, a reviewer writes, the stage was left to Mr. Karl Marx, who, with a hopeful air, waved the red flag over the smoke of his escort's revolvers. So for the Lord Chamberlain's office, the group theatre's particular mode of production, dependent as it was on corporeal rhetoric, proved something of a censoring conundrum. When the group theatre submitted The Dance of Death for licensing in July 1935, it was in the midst of this period that saw the Lord Chamberlain's office becoming increasingly sensitive to either communist propaganda, critiques of the Nazi regime, etc. Despite The Dance of Death's presentation of syphilitic Germanic fascism that is ultimately stamped out by communism incarnate, the reader, Street, had no objections to The Dance of Death apart from finding it the most incomprehensible play I have had the misfortune to read. Street writes that it is fair to say that the announcer describes the play as a picture of a decline of a class and so on, and that the dancer is death. But I decline to believe that I have lost my wits, and therefore I assert that no meaning emerges from the text. I see nothing to censor. The ambiguity of the politics of The Dance of Death, created not by the text on its own, but rather by this complex interaction of text, corporeal rhetoric, and visual metaphor, worked in the group theatre's favor. The reader's report is brief and perfunctory, and the Lord Chamberlain's commentary is limited to a manuscript edition at the bottom of this letter that reads, "I agree that this is a most incomprehensible play, but I suppose some people will say they understand it." By October 1935, during the run of The Dance of Death, Street had a realization about the group theatre. The group theatre seems destined to give the censorship more trouble than all the other theatres put together. This comment does form part of a larger report that Street wrote on the group theatre's submission of The Infernal Machine, Cocteau's version of the Oedipus myth, ultimately not recommended for licensing because it staged the lovemaking of mother and son. But it reveals much about Street's evolving understanding of the group theatre. Whether Street was disapproving of the politics of The Dance of Death in performance is unclear, but his reports reveal a new awareness of the close eye with which the group theatre had to be examined. In that same October, the group theatre additionally submitted Auden and Christopher Isherwood's The Dog Beneath the Skin for licensing, and Street's report begins with the happy realization that this is less incoherent than The Dance of Death, although its satire is equally difficult to follow. Nevertheless, Street discerned that the play was an obvious attack on Germany, and he assumed that many people will object to the whole play as communist propaganda. Street realized that the play cannot wisely be banned on that score, and so he instead provided this lengthy list of lines and images that had to be amended. Actually, they had to be entirely cut before it could be approved. And he assumed that if the Lord Chamberlain requires all of these excisions, the authors will just withdraw the play. It would not be a great loss. So the group theatre did not withdraw the play, and they instead embarked on this extensive process of emendation and approval that concluded with H.C. Game, who was a representative of the Lord Chamberlain, attending a rehearsal of The Dog Beneath the Skin to ensure that the suspect scenes were appropriate in performance. Game had to confess that he liked this highbrow frolic, which he found reminiscent of a satirical Jos ballet, but he did note that one of the characters carries a swastika flag, which won't do, and another marches up and down giving the Nazi salute. With the omission of both, The Dog Beneath the Skin finally earned its license just days prior to the performance. So in closing, it is important to note that we can only speculate as to precisely what Street may have censored in The Dance of Death if given the opportunity, although the Nazi salutes and the big flags with the Iron Cross are sort of likely candidates. But it is telling that in his report, he highlights the incomprehensibility of the text, offers no discussion of politics, suspect or otherwise, and thereafter comes to view the group theatre as the bane of his censorial existence. It does not seem as though either Auden or Doone had intended to evade censorship in this way. Their later works, such as The Dog Beneath the Skin, certainly suggested there was no sort of concerted effort to avoid endorsements of communism or overt critiques of Germanic fascist regimes. But Auden may have been pleasantly surprised at the way in which Doone's dance-inspired dramatic theories proved significant for his own quest for creating political theatre. Auden, who known for his left-wing sympathies, had picked up an interest in creating politically engaged theatre probably during the 9 months that he spent in Berlin in the late 1920s. There, he witnessed the violent politics of late Weimar, and was exposed to a provocative cabaret scene, expressionist cinema, and more. The group theatre, although it would take on something of a left-wing colouring, was less explicitly political than many of its German or British contemporaries. The workers' theatre movement, for example, was distinguished by its sort of revolutionary communist politics and its commitment to agitprop theatre. What Doone and Auden created at the group theatre was not a platform for propaganda, although this would have made the Lord Chamberlain's job much easier. What Doone and Auden created was rather a place to explore the possibilities generated in blurring the boundary between the sort of poetic and the political. So, thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Thanks so much. That was a really interesting talk there. And I am so glad that you brought up Kurt Joost there.
Yeah.
Because as I'm looking at the photographs, I'm thinking green table, and I'm just wondering if what was the date of Green Table when it was actually performed in Britain?
33, I think.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if the censor saw that.
Yeah.
And what he might have made of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It certainly seems that H.C. Game was familiar with Joost's work. And it's an interesting question about what would have been sort of not allowed in the Green Table if we don't have the words and maybe actual Nazi salutes to cut out what is it that is too motivating politically. It's an interesting question. I don't know if any of the censors had the chance to see it. Yeah.
Did you say what the music was?
I didn't.
Can you tell us?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Herbert Merle did the music for this, and it was a lot of sort of parodies of popular forms, but there was also a drum beat that accompanied the dancer. So if we think about that scene when the chorus is sort of swaying back and forth and the announcer has this xenophobic tirade, there's also a drum beat going throughout that entire thing, and that accompanied the dancer whenever he was on stage. But there's also some musical changes between the text and the performance. When Karl Marx enters in the text, it's to Mendelssohn's Wedding March, which suggests a sort of, an interesting sort of marriage between Marx and the middle class at this point, which is withdrawn in the performance, and it's replaced with Chopin's Funeral March, which is a very different meaning. Yes, so yeah, music is a really interesting aspect of this.
Leading on from music, a little after this, Auden worked with Britain on the cantata Our Hunting Fathers, which ends with a dance of death.
Yeah.
Is that a totally different piece?
Yes, so the Dance of Death was being used in so many different ways around this time, and Auden explored it in his poetry as well. So the actual connections, it's hard to say. Britain was, of course, working at the group theatre, so I would imagine there's sort of these ideas floating around anyway.
Great photographs, by the way. I would also add a connection to the Massine symphonic ballets in this period.
Interesting. Yes, Doone worked quite often with Massine.
Can you tell us who the performers were, the ensemble performers, where they came from, what their background was?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So there is...
Gabriela, can you tell us who the performers were and where they came from?
So I do have the names in my notes. I don't know off the top of my head. But what's interesting is they were not all necessarily dancers, but they were being trained by Doone in various methods. They went to these summer schools, actually, where they would, I don't have the photographs. The photographs are in the talk from last year, where they would learn Dalcrozian eurythmics, for example, but also one of the actors said the sort of basics of classical ballet. So an interesting combination that they were being trained in.
Any more questions?
I just want to make another footnote. Do you know about the connection of the Nazi
I don't know. That's a really interesting question, though.
It's something I'm asking. I happen to know my answer to my question.
Okay.
It's fascinating because of this period. She moves to America in 1933. He starts to choreograph Serenade in, I think, March 1934. And he began talking, according to Rosanna Boris, who is one of his 17 young women in their teens, and began talking about Europe and where he'd come from, and how there was this terrible man, and he did the Hitler moustache. He said he does this awful gesture, but I'm not. He said he looks a bit like me, except I don't have a moustache. And he said, I'm going to give you the suit, but I'm not going to give you the suit. So he showed them the Nazi suit, and then he turned it out, and then he showed them the beginning Serenade, and that's already a turned out version of the Nazi salute that Balanchine used, and then he shows how you break it, you fragment it, and you go into the beginning of Balanchine's choreography. So this salute's on so many people's minds as early as 1934, 1935.
Yeah. The American context is really interesting there, because I think in the US, until partway through the Second World War, this salute was still being used for the Pledge of Allegiance, which is also some interesting connotations. But
If we looked at Boris Reich, none of us knew what he was talking about.
yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about expressionism in general, or the Ausdruckstanz. You've spoken before about this kind of influence on Rupert Doone, sort of combined with his very short experience with the Ballet Russe. Do you feel that in the notes that you've studied there, that this kind of influence of expressionism is coming up, through obviously through Jos and so on? But I just wondered if there's anything kind of technically that you feel he's picking up on.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because on the one hand, Doone is saying that poetic drama should essentially be like a Diaghlevian marriage of the arts with a poetic dramatic text. But he was also, when he first saw the Green Table, he thought that was exactly the type of thing that he wanted to be doing. And he had sort of been communicating with Laban and Jos about potentially collaborating. And of course, he trained his dancers in these methods. So there was, I think, a lot of influence there, and certainly what he was aspiring to do, yes. Yeah.
Any more questions? Anyone? Yes? Yeah, Marcus.
Thank you so much as well for laying out at the beginning the kind of like the openness of notation, like all of how stage direction can become a notation that like guides or informs performance. I'm wondering about the relationship, when we like saw it in Alice's talk this morning, of like the gaps and slips that get opened up through like the active performance that are different from notation, and like maybe what problems or questions that raises about like an original, like a stable form of a dance that like can be censored, or maybe this was the problem for the censors, that this notation of text was like unpredictable when it was being seen on stage.
Yeah, it's really interesting, both in terms of how censors would have been reading it and how we read it now, because of course most of this description is based on layers of contextual information. If we have the photographs and the prompt book and the reviews and the accounts, we can see what the dance probably was like. And I suppose the censors, just having the prompt book, didn't stand a chance there. Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's an interesting point in terms of how this particular piece was performed for a private audience in 1934 and a public audience in 1935, and the differences between those are quite difficult to figure out as well, assuming there were some differences that came about. But yeah, it's quite difficult to pick these out.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus.
Not many. I think it was on for a few weeks. Yeah, alongside Elliot's Sweeney Agonistes.
Okay, any more questions at all? All right, I think in that case we've nearly caught up with ourselves, which is wonderful, and that was wonderful to open up the whole question of what constitutes notation and what we can recover from the past. What, you know, we're thinking about historiographies of dramaturgy, of dance, and the way in which they interact so profoundly, I think, at that moment in the early 20th century, when you've got, you know, Eliot and everybody trying to promote verse drama, and there's so much movement within imagined for the chorus and so on. We didn't even get to talk about the chorus, and but the element of the choral element is so important, isn't it, in Doone's play. So let's, without further ado, go for lunch. Okay, and thank Gabriela very much indeed for a really stimulating talk. Thank you.